Welcome to Wellness Through Physical Therapy. I'm Paula Degnan, and we are social distancing today. Ting-O isn't here with me now, but he will be here in a few moments, although I'll be over there, so you won't see me, but you don't have to. You just need to find out what Ting is going to be telling you. And if you've been spending a lot of time with the remote control, you might need to know all about Carpal Tunnel. So don't go away. When we come back, Carpal Tunnel, Wellness Through Physical Therapy. Welcome back to Wellness Through Physical Therapy, and with me, Ting-O. Hey,
Paula. How's it going?
All the way across the room.
Hello.
Oh, my hand hurt. That's because I've been spending an awful lot of time watching TV, turning that channel from one to another.
Yep.
So tell us a little bit about carpal tunnel, because people are still working from home on the computer.
Yeah, so we're finding a lot of people have been working remotely. And those that haven't been working have been spending more time on like laptops, computers, cell phones, typing away. So that's a very classical mechanism of injury that creates carpal tunnel syndrome, because when you do that a lot, the carpal tunnel runs through here. It actually puts a lot of pressure on the nerve itself, which creates carpal tunnel syndrome. So there's been some new innovations in diagnostics and treatment of carpal tunnel syndrome recently. So with it coming to the fore because of people doing more remote work, ourselves included, because we've been doing more computer work instead of seeing people on site. So we're finding out, a lot of people are at risk of getting to carpal tunnel syndrome, and we want to sort of share with the people out there what you can do if you have carpal tunnel syndrome beyond surgery and injections, which is what people tend to look towards when they do get that injury.
Let's talk a little bit about getting that injury. You showed your hands, and how are there things that we can do in order to, now of course a lot of people won't do them anyway, and that's why we need to know how to deal with it, but are there things that we should be doing in order to help our hands have a better positioning?
Well, yeah, the carpal tunnel runs this way. So what happens there is that anytime you bend your wrist that way, you're going to stretch that nerve. And anytime you bend your wrist all the way that way, you're going to compress it. So if you're doing this forwards and backwards consistently, that's fine. But if you're holding it there for a prolonged period of time, you're going to get like a strain. If you're doing that for a period of time, you're probably going to compress it. So for the people out there that are on computers like 8 hours a day like this, that's obviously not great.
Or a mouse?
Yeah, or a mouse. So what you want to do is you want to try and find a position. I think they got little pads in some of the keyboards these days that will butt right there, so you can keep your wrist in a neutral position instead of like that. Same thing when you're working on iPads and that. If you're in that position a lot, maybe that's not a great position. So just be aware of your wrist positioning when you're doing a lot of tech devices, because if you sustain a position for too long, it can cause an injury of the carpal tunnel.
And then what happens that you would know that that's what's going on? Because,
so classically carpal tunnel syndrome affects 3 fingers in your hand only. So only these 3. It can sometimes potentially affect half the 4th one, but if it's affecting this one, it's not carpal tunnel syndrome. Or if it's in the back of the hand, in the fingers, it's not carpal tunnel syndrome as well. So classical carpal tunnel syndrome, you'll get pain either through the wrist into these 3 fingers. It could be burning, pain, numbness, irritation of any sorts, but that's the classical carpal tunnel syndrome. It's typically made worse by a lot of hand use, like if you're gripping stuff, if you're trying to lift heavy things. But just remember that if it's affecting all the fingers, it's probably not carpal tunnel syndrome.
When you're talking about getting a diagnosis, then are there ways that you would do that if you came in and you said, Ting, I'm not sure, but maybe what would you do?
So There are ways of physically diagnosing clinical tests for carpal tunnel syndrome, and so there's a couple of tests that we would do in the office. Like one of them is called the Tunnel sign, which is very simply just tapping your wrist, and if that recreates the tingling, numbness, or anything that's affecting your fingers, then there's a higher chance that you might have it. Another test is called the Falen's test, which is when you do that with your fingers, with your wrists. If you hold that for 30 seconds, I just read a study where the highest accuracy in terms of this test is to hold it for 30 seconds. And then same thing, you're looking for reproduction of the symptoms. But one of the diagnostic tests that we can do that can really have a higher accuracy in terms of diagnosing is called an EMG/nerve conduction study. And what that does is it tells us whether it's the nerve that's the problem versus something else. And it also shows us the extent of the injury, whether it's just a compression, whether the lining has been irritated, or whether the actual nerve itself has been damaged. And the importance of that is that based on what you have in severity, treatment is targeted differently for each problem. So if you have like just a mild irritation, we would treat you a particular way. If you have nerve damage, we would treat you a completely different way. So understanding, one, that it's carpal tunnel syndrome is great, but two, if you know the severity and the type of damage that's happening, obviously that really helps in terms of treatment. And if we go ahead and do the test and we find it's like, whoa, this is really bad, obviously we would refer you to a surgeon at that point if that's indicated.
Oh, and when we're talking about people coming in to see you, I'm assuming that you start with questions.
Yeah, obviously we want to try and figure out what it is, because a lot of things can mimic carpal tunnel syndrome. Neck pain can mimic it. There's other nerves around, there's trigger points around, there's muscles around, and there's like arthritis that can mimic carpal tunnel syndrome. So identifying it is extremely important, because obviously if it's a neck problem, we don't want to be treating a carpal tunnel. It's not going to get any better.
Well, we're going to find out more about that, because we will be back to continue our discussion, Wellness Through Physical Therapy, carpal tunnel syndrome, and all the things about it, so don't go away. Welcome back to Wellness Through Physical Therapy. I'm over here, Ting is over there, and we're talking carpal tunnel syndrome.
Yes, we are.
And Ting, again, you gave us such a good background of things to look for and the things that people should be doing that they're not, obviously.
Right.
And we did focus a lot on computers and games, but people work in factories and other places where they're doing these repetitive motions. And just before we went into our break, you were telling us about it could be neck, it could be, it must be very difficult to try and pinpoint.
Yeah, it's very hard. Carpal tunnel can be very easily diagnosed in like certain people, but there are some out there that you're just not sure. So, and you want to be as accurate as possible, because this day and age, we have the technology to do that. We can really get in there and diagnose it. And so what we want to do is, give someone the best chance they can of getting better. And the best way of doing that is to be as accurate in the diagnostics as possible, which is where some of the tools that we've come across is really helpful. And knowing the right diagnostics can also really impact the treatment of it as well.
Is it possible to have carpal tunnel somewhere else? You mentioned neck, or is that just...
No, the carpal tunnel is the name of the tunnel that the nerve goes through in the wrist. So, but for people with potential neck pain, there's a condition, we call it radiculopathy or referred pain. So it's like sciatica, but of your arm. And so if you have a neck pain that's pinching on a nerve as such, it can replicate the tingling and pain and numbness in the fingers. So, and like I say, treatment really, really, really is dependent on what the problem is. So we need to get as accurate of a diagnosis as we possibly can to be able to treat right. For example, in the case of like just a compression of the carpal tunnel, One of the classic stretches that people do for carpal tunnel syndrome, it's all over YouTube, is what we call a median nerve glide or a tension test. So, and basically I'll reproduce it if the camera can see my arm. It's in this position here. So what you're doing is you're putting that carpal tunnel nerve on full stretch in that position. So you're basically stretching the nerve like you would stretch a hamstring or a bicep muscle. Okay, but if you're doing that in the wrong condition, so for example, if I did that for a nerve that's showing some nerve damage, so a nerve is like an electrical wire, right? Mm-hmm. And the electrical wire inside is made out of thousands of fibers strung together. So imagine that some of those fibers are starting to tear, and then if you're treating it by putting it more of a stretch, that obviously isn't great, right?
Ooh, yeah.
So knowing the extent of the injury really helps the treatment, like I say, because if we find someone with some nerve damage, we're not going to have them do this stretch. We're going to do what's called a relaxer stretch, which is something that will put the nerve on this side at rest. And the way we do that is we stretch the opposite side. So imagine there's a rope connecting this nerve to that nerve, and then if we put that nerve on stretch, you got a rope, right? And you're pulling one end of it, the other rope side of it is going to be relaxed or loosened, laxed up. So basically, if you're having just a compression injury, you would do what we call a flossing or a sliding. So imagine that nerve sliding as I do this through the carpal tunnel. That's just for a mild injury where there's some compression. If there's a myelin injury where the lining of the nerve is irritated, we would do that stretch because that's what helps the stretching. It helps the nutrition of the lining, which is what you want in that situation. But if the nerve is damaged, you're going to stretch the other side because that takes the tension on here and relaxes this nerve here. So that's why, you know, I really, since we've come to understand diagnostics, I really try my best to use those diagnostics to our treatments. And if we can use those diagnostics and what we find out in the diagnostics for our treatments, the outcomes are a lot better. And they found by using the diagnostics, we have a 62% better chance of being more accurate in terms of our treatments as a result.
We've talked about so many different areas, and it always fascinates me when someone comes into you and says, Ting, this hurts, and before they leave, you find out that that's a residual and that's not where the problem is at all.
Right.
So here's another example of that.
Right. It's very classical. Carpal tunnel syndrome is like the other day, I've been doing some nerve conduction studies in EMGs, and you know, people come to me with fairly convinced that they have carpal tunnel syndrome or ulnar nerve injury, which is another nerve injury here, and then you do the test and it's not the case. I think I referenced this one time before when someone came in with pain down in the leg, in the shin, and they were convinced, their physicians were convinced that the problem was coming from the back. So after we did the diagnostics, we actually found there was a nerve right in here that was being pinched. So obviously treating the back was not going to help in that instance, and we started treating the leg. And you know, being as accurate as you can in terms of understanding the injury really helps the outcomes.
And when you're talking about being as accurate as you can, none of these different types of things show up on X-ray.
No, not nerves. Nerves won't show up on X-ray. So X-ray will only show bones. The go-to for a lot of testing, for a lot of injuries in the body, soft tissue, used to be MRIs. But what they found is because of the expense of MRIs and the sensitivity, or I should say accuracy of it, isn't too much higher than some of the other diagnostic tests that we do, like ultrasound imaging. So instead of paying like $800 to $1,000 for an MRI, you can get away with paying $100 or $200 for an ultrasound image, and you're about 3 or 4 points in terms of accuracy. So it's some of the testing that we do as well is live as well. So we can move things around. We can like try and really hone into things, which people, because if we're looking for a structure and we see a structure, we can ask them then and there, is that where it hurts? And they'll tell you yes or no. So that way we know we're on the right spot or not. So yeah, there is a lot of imaging out there, but obviously we're looking for ones that are as accurate as possible, like I always say, and you have to be fiscally responsible as well. If you can do something for slightly cheaper, then obviously that's great as well.
And the equipment that you're using here obviously takes care of all that. And it's not as, because when you say MRI, I think, woo, big machine, you know, lots of hours.
Right.
But it's not the case here.
No, I mean, yeah, an ultrasound takes, depending on the ultrasound, one joint will probably take 15 minutes. And you know, obviously MRIs have their place and definitely are needed in medicine. But some of I'll say, some of the injuries that we deal with, you can really get a good idea of what's going on with a diagnostic ultrasound or an ultrasound imaging machine.
Well, we'll talk some more about that, and we will be back with more Wellness Through Physical Therapy in just a moment. Welcome back to Wellness Through Physical Therapy. Paula over here, Ting over there. He's the man with all the answers when it comes to carpal tunnel. We've been talking about diagnosing the carpal tunnel, the different elements that you use here. So what happens then when someone is diagnosed and you can take it from whether you want to start with something mild or go right to severe? What do you do?
So yeah, when we diagnose, we want to try and split the diagnostics into three main categories. One, there's just a compression on the nerve, which is fairly, there's no nerve injury itself, it's just something that's being pinched. Two, thinking of an electrical wire again, the outer lining of the wire is slightly damaged, and that's what we call a myelin injury. And three, thinking of electrical wire, now we're thinking about the actual internal structure of the nerve being damaged. So once we break down those three areas, we can treat. So if it's a case of just the pinched nerve, that's obviously the best case scenario. What we're doing then is we're trying to relax a lot of the structures in the area and a lot of the forearm muscles, because they pass through the same tunnel. And if things are tight like a guitar string, they can really press the nerve into the bone, or into the ligament that sits on top. So in the case of just a pinched carpal tunnel, what we do at that point is we do a lot of loosening structural techniques like soft tissue mobilizations, massage therapy, trigger point releases, and those types of things to try and loosen things up. And obviously exercise is great for that as well. For the people out there, look up tendon glides. If you're looking for carpal tunnel exercises, they're great to do as well in that situation. In the second case, where the lining or the myelin is injured, what we want to do, you're looking at an actual injury there at that point. So what we want to do is we want to try and encourage the healing process of that myelin. So at that stage, we'd do probably similar things as we would do if you had just a pinched nerve, but we would probably add some more aggressive treatments, not that painful aggressive, but just try to get the healing process. Things like cold laser, because cold laser has been found to be good for the healing process. We would potentially use our miracle wave on it to try and encourage the circulation and healing.
And you have all that here?
Yeah, we have all that here. Some of the techniques that I've shown in previous shows, things like scraping, cupping, just to try and get the circulation, get the flow, plus do the carpal tunnel tensioner stretch that we would do, and things like nerve glides, and that is like, I would consider that like a moderate type injury. But when you're talking about nerve damage, which is the third category, we have to like really take that seriously, because then you're starting to talk like long-term issues if that nerve damage isn't repaired. So at that point, what we want to do is do our best to try and get that carpal tunnel nerve to start to re-heal itself. So one great thing that we use here is called the rebuilder. It's an electrical current that's been found to stimulate nerves, and once we get the compression off the carpal tunnel, that can really help us get that nerve to fire again, to try and to repair itself as such.
And it's non-invasive.
It's non-invasive. All of this is non-invasive. And we would do relaxer techniques, like I mentioned before, of the opposite carpal tunnel nerve. And things like cold laser again, the scraping, the cupping, just to try and encourage that healing process to take place. And so the thing you have to understand is that you want to, a lot of people out there will go and try and do the most aggressive thing they can think about to try and heal a problem. So if you have carpal tunnel syndrome, a lot of people look on YouTube and think, oh yeah, this is the exercise I should be doing. So, but you want to be sure that when you're trying to find your exercises that you know the extent of your injury, because let's say we tore a hamstring muscle,
Right.
you're not going to want to stretch that hamstring muscle, for the first 4 weeks. You want it to heal. Same thing applies to carpal tunnel syndrome. You want to know if you've torn that carpal tunnel nerve. You want to know if it's just a pinched nerve, and that really impacts the treatments. But yeah, so all the treatments are relatively pain-free.
How long do they take?
How long do they take?
So if someone comes in for treatment and you say, okay, we're going to do this today, how much time should I figure I'll be here?
So classically, most people would think about maybe being in physical therapy for about 45 minutes, somewhere around there to an hour, depending on the extent of the injury. Obviously, if it's a simple injury and you just need a little bit done, 20 minutes. So it all depends. Cold laser treatment takes about 5 minutes. Some joint mobilization, the nerve stretches. So what we do is we combine all these things, and a lot of the research shows that for most injuries of the body, when you just do one thing, like stretch a nerve, may not be as effective as if you stack things on top of it. Like you stretch the nerve, you loosen the muscles, you help the healing process. So obviously we want to give people value for money, and we want to give them the best chance of healing. And the best chance of healing is if you stack up a lot of these things, because an injury is never an individual one structure injury.
And it's just like anybody's injury, yours is different than mine,
Right.
than anybody else who may be watching. So you want to make sure you're doing the right thing.
Of course,
Because
yeah.
you can even make it worse.
Yes, and we've seen a lot of people do that, obviously.
So we certainly hope that you at home will be able to utilize what Ting has told us. And of course, if you need him, you can
here.
always just get in touch with him.
Yep.
We'll catch you
Certainly.
back soon. Wellness through physical therapy.